Hey everybody, welcome to Real Life. We're so glad that you are here. Especially want to welcome everybody inside, those of you outside on this wonderful Thursday night. What an incredible weekend ahead of us. Hope you had a great Memorial Day weekend last weekend. And I don't know how excited you were about coming to church tonight, but I have a feeling you're going to be glad that you did. Because have you ever thought that you could make money by going to church? It's a real possibility. And bigger than that, you have a possibility to discover peace like maybe you never have before. And we're going to talk about that. And I just got to tell you, I've been so excited about this series that we're kicking off today because I know the potential that it has in everybody's life when it comes to them just experiencing a different level of God, a different understanding of God, a different trust in God, and seeing God provide for them in ways that maybe they've never seen before. And that's what we're going to talk about here in just a moment. So when you came in, you were handed an envelope, and some of you have already broken the rules and opened it. I'm going to ask you to keep that to yourself. Some of you are good rule keepers, and you have not opened that, and that's fantastic. So please do not open that envelope until later on, and we're all going to open it together. And my prayer for this series, and my prayer for our time together today, is that this will be life-changing. That this will be challenging for some of us, that it'll be beneficial to all of us, and it will be certainly helpful for every one of us wanting to understand how to have a little bit more contentment in our lives. Okay, so maybe you recognize this emoji or this kind of lettering of the number 100 here behind me, but it does come from an emoji, and Apple recently said that this is the most popular emoji that people are using right now. Now, maybe it's not the one you're using, but collectively, as a group of human beings, apparently we're using this one the most. And it really kind of means, 100%. You might send this emoji if you're saying, yep, I'm all in, or I agree. But what's interesting about this emoji is it comes from kind of, the education field. In fact, it goes all the way back to Japan when teachers would begin to use this, collection of numbers to indicate if a student got 100% on their test. And those of you that are educators, or those of you who just finished up your finals, this is a number that hopefully you're familiar with, or hopefully you've had to give out or to receive, but it basically means you got it all right, 100%. And originally, this emoji was about taking a test. Now, why do I tell you that tonight? Because every single week, maybe it's every other week, maybe it's once a month, but all of us have a test that we are facing. All of us are facing a test at least once a month, maybe twice a month, maybe 4 times, where we have an opportunity to put our faith to the test and to prove to God that our hearts trust Him. This is a test where God tests our trust in Him, where God tests our commitment to Him. And every few weeks, you probably get some sort of a paycheck. Or maybe if you're still in the house, an allowance. And this is your opportunity to take this test. Every time you get paid, you have an opportunity to experience and participate in the 100 test. And the test is based on this: where is your heart? And the way we handle this test can impact how much money you have, how much contentment you have, how much peace you have, and how much you begin to see God work in your life. And so today, we're going to talk about this story that Jesus tells to emphasize something that has everything to do with the people He was dealing with then, but especially for us now. And I'm just going to start at the end. You know, on those TV shows where they show you the end first and they say 5 years earlier, and then you back up and you kind of see how you got there. I'm going to start at the end because Jesus says something that is one of the more famous things that He ever said. And maybe you've heard it before, or maybe you've heard a version of this before, and even if you've never been to church before, you might have heard somebody say this. But if you look at what He really said, it's really kind of confusing as to why He would say it this way. Take a look at the end of the story we're going to read here in just a minute. This is what Jesus says. He says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Now think about that for a second. That's backwards, isn't it? We would expect Jesus to say that where your heart is, then your treasure will be. Aren't these the things that we say to each other? You know, what you love is kind of where your money goes. And we think that our money follows our heart. But Jesus says just the opposite. Jesus says that where your money goes, there your heart will be. Now think about that for a second. I mean, this is why Jesus is so brilliant, because he knows what we talk ourselves out of. He's exactly right. You think about it. If you buy that brand new car, suddenly your heart follows. And you wash it maybe once a week, maybe twice a week. Maybe you go out and you wiped off the dust off of it that can come from the Santa Ana winds. You make sure to park in the back of the lot. You make sure to take care of that thing, right? For some of you, you got interested in a certain stock and you bought stock in something, and what do? You start checking that. You start using that app that Apple gives you that you think, I'm never going to use that, until you start buying stock. And now you're looking at stocks all the time because your heart follows where your money goes. How we manage our treasure is a heart test. Now, let's just say what everybody's thinking right now, and that is anytime we talk about money in the church, everybody gets a little funny about it. We just get feeling a little weird. It's almost like this is something that should be off limits. And I understand that feeling. I mean, there are preachers and there are churches and there are pastors that have abused this topic. And there are those that have done things that it's just embarrassing for me in my profession of what they've said and what they've done when it comes to money. But my job is to teach you the full Word of God and everything that God has to say. And Jesus spoke about money more than anything else, more than heaven, more than hell, even more than peace. Jesus talked about money a lot because he knew that where your treasure is, there your heart will go. And the reality is, I mean, this is a big issue for all of us. In fact, it's funny, I've been a pastor for 25 years now. And that's right, I started when I was 10. But I've been a pastor for 25 years, and typically when people come up to me and say, hey, pastor, I need to talk to you about something, in my mind, I know it's about one or two things. It's either about money or it's about sex. That's it. And the people will come up and say, hey, can I get a meeting with you? And I'm thinking, is it money? Is it sex? It's one of those two things, right? My marriage is really struggling. Is it sex or is it money? I'm wrestling with things at work. Is it sex or is it money? My teenage son is having issues. It's probably not money. It's probably sex. It's one of these two things is what it always comes back to. And so we typically say, well, the church shouldn't talk about those things, but these are the things we do need to talk about because these are the things that cause us the most anxiety and stress in our lives. And to be honest with you, these are the things we want to talk about. You think about it. All of us want to know how to better manage our finances. In fact, this past Easter, we gave everybody a survey and said, let us know what you want to talk about. You know what the number one thing was? It was stress. We want to talk about stress. And you know what the number one thing people are stressed about? It's money. How do I get more of it? How do I keep what I have? How do I invest it the right way? How do I get out of debt? How do I pay for the things that I want? How do I take care of what might be coming down the road? But yet, for some reason, we don't like to talk about it at church. Now, we like to talk about it. We like to read about it. Amazon has tens of thousands of books on how to manage your resources. And we hear people talk about it. We listen to podcasts and we watch YouTube videos about how to manage our money better. But maybe, just maybe, God might have something to say about it that might impact our world incredibly. And I think the reason some of us don't want to talk about it is partly out of embarrassment. We don't like to admit some of the issues that we're dealing with or some of the messes we've got in. But let me just tell you, we've all dealt with it. For some of us, it's not that we feel embarrassed. We just feel a little bit of pride, like, I got this figured out. I know what I'm doing. I'm making bank right now. Everything's going great. Yeah, but we still need to talk about it. And sometimes it's about fear. We're afraid that it might take us down a road we don't want to go. And I don't want to know what I'm doing is wrong. So here's what I can promise you. Over the next 2 weeks that we talk about this, I want nothing from you. I want something for you. I want God's best for you. And I get passionate about this topic because I've seen what God has done in my life and with Lori and I's marriage and raising kids and all of that. I've just seen what God has done and the way that God has come through and the way that God has provided, not just for us, but for countless others of people in our churches. And I want that for you. I want you to experience that level of peace and contentment, and maybe even financial reward. But it only happens one way. And so over these next 2 weeks, we're going to just talk about God's financial plan. You can get mad at me all you want, but it's God's plan. It's not my plan. I didn't come up with it. It's His. And I'm just kind of naming this the 100 plan. And it's a very simple financial plan based on the wisdom of the Bible. And for those of you that are constantly scrolling through Barnes & Noble or through Amazon trying to find a book on how to manage your resources, or you need to talk to a financial planner or whatever, I'm just going to make it really simple for you. And we're going to just get this right out for everybody to understand. It's so simple that every single one of us can follow it. In fact, for any danger you've dealt with in your life or any frustration you felt with finances, it's because you've probably steered away from this plan. And this can be something you can deal with in your life, whether you have a lot of money or a little bit of money or no money. It's simply called the 100 plan, or it's also called the 10-10-80 plan, which of course equals 100. So what does this mean? Well, it means this. The first 10% of your income, every time you get paid, according to God, is you got to give it back to God. You got to get generous with God. Does God need your money? No. But God knows that where your money goes, your heart will go. And God says, I want you to give me what's called a tithe. The tithe is simply a mathematical term that means 10%. And it's returning it to God through the local church that you're a part of. If you're bothered by that and don't want to do that here, then give it to another church. That's fine. The most important thing is that you give it back to God through your local church. Every time you get paid, you and I face a test. Who are we going to trust? Who are we going to say thank you to first? What's the first money that's going to leave our hand? Because the money that leaves your hand first is the thing that you trust in the most. Some of us prefer to thank Visa first. Some of us prefer to thank Amazon first. Some of us, we tend to thank our mortgage first. But here's what you have to ask yourself. Can Visa bless my finances? Can Amazon bless my finances? I mean, Amazon Prime is a blessing for all, but can Amazon truly bless our finances? We honor God with the first and best, and then He promises to bless the rest. We honor God with the first and the best, and then He promises to bless the rest. That's the first 10. The second 10 is we save. This is where you pay yourself. You pay yourself 10% where you just put it away for a rainy day. That could be a vacation, that could be retirement, that could be college. You just save. Save 10% every time you do it. Now, for everybody listening right now that's over the age of 40, you're thinking, I wish I would have started that when I was in high school. And for those of you that are in high school, you're thinking, yeah, I'll get to that when I'm over 40. I'm telling you, start it now. 10% you save. You are creating margin in your life for your future. And then the final 10% is basically for you. That's what you live on. That's what you get to spend. You take and you spend that on everything else. This is what you pay your bills out of. So you pay God, you pay yourself, and then you live on the rest. And it's that simple. This is the 100 plan, the 10-10-80 plan, or we might call it the give, save, spend plan, or the give, save, live plan. And here's what I want you to understand. Some of you are thinking right now, yeah, I've heard this before, we've talked about this before, makes a lot of sense, whatever, and I've tried it and it didn't work. Here's the thing that you might be missing. The order and the sequence in which you do these 3 steps is just as important as the percentage. You see, sometimes we're good with the 10-10-80 idea, we just do it backwards. And we start off with the 80, then the 10, and then the 10. And you know as well as I do, when you start off with the 80 and you decide your budget is based upon live, save, and give, by the time you get to give, there's often nothing left. Now think about that for a second. Let me just give you a hypothetical. I'm not saying this has ever happened to anybody, but let's say, for instance, you're rolling through Costco one day. And you're going in there just to get groceries, and it's on your list, and you're just getting everything you need, but you walk by that big, beautiful 4K television, and it's stunning, and it weighs like 3 pounds, and it's just the most beautiful picture you've ever seen. And all you've got at home is you are just slumming it with an HD. And you think, how in the world can I watch sports, or watch my favorite programs, or watch Netflix, on a lowly HD. And I feel your pain. And you see that 4K television, you think, boy, that would really be great. It's not in the budget right now, but man, that would really be great. And fast forward, just all the arguing with yourself you do there in the aisle, and you walk out of there with that 4K television, and you're thinking, how am I going to pay for this? Well, I know 80 could turn into 90 and maybe 100 of my budget. And we just edge God out of the equation. And that's why the sequence in which you do these steps is just as important as the percentages. And for many of us, where we get messed up is we start in with live and then save and then give. But let me ask you, God will not bless any area of your life where He is not first place. So is that act putting God first? Visa can't bless your finances. Target can't bless your finances, but God can, but only when He's first. In fact, take a look at what one of the scriptures teaches us about this whole concept of tithing. The purpose of tithing, it's not because God needs your money. It's because it teaches you always to put God first in your lives. He wants to be your top priority. This is not, a democracy. He is in charge. He is the king. He is the Lord. And as we talked about over the Modgenic series, the backwards kingdom of Jesus, this is the king that we're serving. And He wants to be your top priority. And honoring God first with your giving represents a heart test for a follower of Jesus. Is God first or not? Now, if you're not a follower of Jesus and you're just kicking the tires on this whole thing, this is a great chance for you to see what we believe around here. But I'm just telling you, if every single one of us who was a follower of Jesus practiced this principle and gave 10% back to their local church, we would wipe out all hunger in the world. There would be food and water for everybody if we just followed the plan that God gave us. Now, back to our story. Jesus is telling this story, and He's addressing what's really at the heart of this whole issue, why we get so hesitant about this money thing, and we don't want people to talk about it. We just want to read about it in our own time. And it has to do with greed. No one likes to walk into a group and say, you know what, I'm greedy, because that's pretty much all of us, right? But Jesus starts to really get at the heart of this whole issue. Take a look at this story in its entirety. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, okay, so just kind of imagine there's a whole group of people standing around Jesus, and people are just calling out questions to Him, and He's talking, and He's telling stories, and somebody yells out, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, here's something that you've probably never seen before, a family argument about money, right? The reality is where there's a will, there's a relative. There's always somebody rolling in looking for a little bit of money. And the truth is that this particular person is having conflict with his brother because he wants to have more of this inheritance for himself. And so he decides to ask Jesus, because teachers back then were commonly asked legal questions like this. And this guy feels like his brother has ripped him off. And so Jesus says this. He says, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" You just got to love Jesus' tact with this, right? This is not my role. This is not what I'm about. But Jesus decides to leverage this as a way to talk about the motive behind it. And then He said to this man, "Watch out." And He says this to everybody there. "Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in abundance of possessions." Now, I want you to notice this here and take a look at this verse. Jesus is not saying possessions are bad. Jesus is not saying a 4K television is bad. I hope not. Jesus is not saying that these kind of things are evil. He's just saying that life does not consist or is not made up of or is not found fulfilling in just having more. Because greed is literally this desire for more. Greed is not about needing what you don't have. Greed is wanting what you cannot get. And Jesus says a man's life does not consist of the abundance of life's possessions. Now think about that. We all believe that to be true. When your kids are bothering you about, I need a new iPad, my friends have a new iPad, what do you say? Life isn't all about stuff, kids. I say that. Family pulls up at a red light. We look over and my kids are commenting on what an amazing car is next to us while we're sitting in the minivan. And I say, kids, not all about possessions. And inside I'm thinking, I wish I had that car. I'm not going to tell my kids that, but that's what I'm thinking right now. I mean, my wife is scrolling through Instagram at night. And she says, look at this exotic tropical vacation that these people went on. This looks amazing. And I say, life's not all about these experiences. Life's not all about these possessions. And inside I'm thinking, I hope every one of them gets just swarmed with mosquitoes while they're there. It's not a Christian thing. It's just me, right? And you have those moments too, because we all tell ourselves that life is not about an abundance of possessions, but the only people that really believe it are those that don't have the possessions, because it's a way for us to self-talk our way out of them. But the reality is we often believe that that is where life is truly found, and Jesus says it's not. It's just not. In fact, he tells this story then to give them this point. He says this parable, which is just a story. It's often been said, an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Now stop at this for just a second. This guy in the story is affluent. He's already acquired great wealth, and this is not a bad guy. Jesus does not say that there's anything wrong with his wealth. He's worked hard for it. He's been successful. There's no problem with that. Here's where the problem comes. Look what happens next. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger barns, and there I will store my surplus grain. Now, notice, he does not plan to do anything evil with his wealth. He just does what he's always done. When he gets more, he builds a bigger barn. He gets more, he builds a bigger barn. Now, this is why this is so important for us. There's a principle in this. All of us have thought this before. If I only had more money, then I'd be generous. If I win the lottery, then I'll give to these organizations. If I only had $1 million, then I would help out these people. But I can tell you what you do with $1 million. The same thing you do with $100. Jesus is painting a picture here of a guy that's just simply going to do more of the same. We tend to think that if we have more, we'll be different. The more money you make does not mean that it will change anything. It does not mean that all of a sudden you'll be content. The fact is that he got more, but it didn't make him generous. It just made him richer. More only makes you do more of what you already do, which if you're practicing live, save, then give, if you get more, you'll just live more and put the other two on the back burner. Jesus continues the story. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. I mean, this guy is saying what many of us say, what we said 20 years ago. If I could make a certain amount of money, then I'd be debt-free, worry-free, not a care in the world. I can retire and relax. And guess what? You may be making that amount right now. But you're not debt-free, you're not worry-free, and you're not carefree. You're simply doing more of what you were already doing. And if you have worries now, you'll have worries with more. Now take a look at what Jesus says next. It's 2 words, but God. Now why does Jesus bring this up? Because he's God in the flesh? Well, maybe. But what does God have to do with a farmer? Everything. Because God controls the weather. There is this eternal factor involved here. At this point, maybe this guy starts to feel this pressure in his chest because something is about to change here. And look what God does. But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you." Now, why did God call him a fool? He didn't call him a fool for being rich. He didn't call him a fool because he got richer. God made him richer. God called him a fool because he assumed his money was only for him. He assumed that his stuff guaranteed him a future. Look how Jesus kind of fleshes this out here. God said to him, "You fool, this very night Your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? In other words, who's going to get it after you're gone? And the answer is somebody else. But not because he was generous, but because he was dead. And now Jesus steps out of the parable and he looks across time at you and at me. And he says this: this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. Now let's stop right there. Because Jesus is saying this to every single one of us. He's saying this is how it will be for whoever is consumed with accumulating things for themselves, but completely ignores God and others. So let's talk about this for a second. If you're going to pass God's test with money, if you're going to see God get involved and bless your finances, if you're going to find peace rather than stress, we have to wrestle with that one phrase. What does rich toward God mean? Well, does that have to do with my time? Mm-mm. My prayer life? Nope. What I do every Sunday? Jesus is very clear. He is talking about financial generosity. And the problem in this story is not that this guy was rich. The problem was he was not rich towards God. So let me ask you, are you, am I, rich towards God? Because if you're going to pass God's test with money, if you're going to see God bless your finances, if you're going to find peace rather than stress, we've got to answer these two questions. Here's the first question. Can God trust me with his money? I mean, think about it. We talk about our stuff, my house, my car, my portfolio, but ultimately, we don't own a thing. What do you call something you can't take with you? You don't call it yours. We are not owners. We are managers. Take a look at what the psalmist says. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And that's what this guy in this story is figuring out. All that I have, all that I build more barns for, to store up and store up, it didn't come from me, and it will one day leave me. The guy in this parable never understood that. He thought it was all his. But the reality is, he is just a manager of what is God's. So ask yourself again, can God trust me with his money? We typically ask the other way around, don't we? God, can I trust you with my money? God, can I be sure you're going to do what I want you to do with my stuff? But God is looking for people that he can entrust his wealth, his riches, and his resources with. God asks us to demonstrate how much we trust him by just giving back 10% to him every single time we get paid. Just to say, you know what, the first 10% that leaves my hands, going right back to you. In fact, God goes so clear as to say, you can test me in this area. It's the only time that God says you can test me in this. But when it comes to your finances, he says, just test me. See if I don't outbless you over and over again. In other words, if you make $5,000 a month, here is the question you have to wrestle with. Is $4,500 with God better than $5,000 without God? Because God only gets involved in places where you put him first. Now, I know that doesn't make sense. And I know you're thinking, you must not have ever taken math. I get it. But God says, when you bless me with the first and the best, then I promise to bless the rest. In fact, Jesus one time says, give, and it will be given back to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over. In other words, you can't outgive God. Which leads to this last question. Am I robbing God? You ever been robbed before? Maybe somebody stole something from you. Nowadays, it's identity theft. We had this situation happen in our house where one day we got a package in the mail, and it was these two elegant gowns. And we had not ordered these. We did not know where they came from, what they were for, whatever. And they came from London, and we started doing some research, and we found out that somebody had somehow got our credit card information and bought these gowns and, hundreds of dollars a piece on these things, but they forgot to change the address where the bill was sent to, and that's where the shipping was going to. And they didn't get the gowns, we got the gowns. We didn't know what to do with these things, right? It's ridiculous. But in that moment, I felt so violated that somebody had our information and robbed us at that moment, even if they didn't get these gowns they were looking for. Maybe you've had that moment. Well, this prophet by the name of Malachi tells about a time when God says he was the theft victim. In fact, this is what he says. Will a mere mortal rob God? But you rob me. But you ask, how are we robbing you? And he says, in tithes and offerings. In other words, when you don't give back to God what is his already, God says, you are robbing from me. So what are we going to do about that? He says, I want you to return to me what is mine. Now, I know that this whole money thing, man, it really begins to mess with your head, right? Because you get really bothered by this. And really, we begin to think that somebody else could do this better than us. But the reality is that the greatest challenge for this whole principle is not for people in the lower income bracket. Studies show that those who make less give more. And the more we make, the more stingy we get. This is the reality that a lot of us are facing. And I want to talk to those of us in this room that are incredibly affluent. And you need to know, first of all, just by living in America, you live better than most people in the world. And just by living here in California and in the state that you're in and in the amount of income that you have, you are doing so much better than 90% of the world right now. And Jesus says, to whom much is given, much is expected. So let me just ask you, are you managing God's resources well? Are you being rich towards God? I got to thinking about this whole thing we're talking about over these couple of weeks. And I thought, what could be the most difficult thing that some of us wrestle with? Is it this idea of, robbing God? No, we don't want to rob God. Is it this idea of 10-10-80? No, that sounds like a good financial plan. That would be fine. Is it this whole idea of, blessing other people? Nope, that's not it at all either. I think the biggest struggle that you and I have with this whole issue of money is this. We just don't believe God owns it all. We may say that, but when it comes right down to it, we really believe we can manage it better ourselves than he can. We can manage it better without him than we can with him. But there comes a moment in every single one of our lives, we all want God involved in our finances. So if the biggest issue is, do we really believe that God owns it all, then I just wanted us to do something that might make us understand what it's like to have somebody else's money. And so right now, what I'm going to ask you to do is just to take that envelope out that you were given on the way in and just open that up. Open up that envelope, take a look at that, because this particular envelope has a dollar bill in it. But here's what I want to challenge you with. I want to challenge you to recognize that you are not holding the church's money. You are holding my money. This is $1 from me. This may be the dumbest thing I have ever done. But we got enough dollar bills for every adult. I'm not trusting my money with your kids. I don't trust my kids with my money, right? We got enough dollar bills for every adult, and this is yours to carry around for the next week. I'm going to ask you to hold on to it. Some of you are going to want to give it back because you don't want the responsibility, but I'm going to ask you to hang on to it for a week and bring it back next weekend. And when you come back next weekend, there's going to be some bins around the room that just simply say Rusty's money, because this is my money, and I'm going to ask you to give me that dollar back, because if you don't, I'm not going to be able to pay the mortgage, okay? And my wife has become accustomed to living indoors. So please, bring me my dollar back, but please carry it with you this week, because you need to know what it's like to carry somebody else's money, because that's what you do with every dollar that you have. It's not yours to begin with. And God only asked for 10% of it back. But don't you dare give me a dime back on that dollar. I need the whole dollar, okay? I want you to take a few days just to carry that thing around and recognize what it's like to carry somebody else's money, because that's what we do every single day. And then I want to challenge you. I want to challenge you to start thinking about making God first priority. And for you to take the next 100 days and you decide to try the tithe. The first 10% that leaves your hand once you get paid goes back to your local church. You can set that up through Difference Makers. You can set that up through the app, through online. But you just decide, the next 100 days, we're going to do the 100 plan. And I think you're going to be blown away with what God does in your life. Friends, once we come to the realization that God owns it all, everything else is easy. The hardest part is not the budgeting. The hardest part is not saying no to a few things. The hardest part is believing that 90% with God is better than 100% without Him. After all, it's all His to begin with. That's your challenge for the week. You carry that dollar, you take care of that thing, and bring it back, and we'll see what God begins to do in our lives. Let's stand up, and I'll close us out with prayer. God, I thank you for all that you've given us, the breath in our lungs, the clothes that we wear, the places that we live, the food that we have, the resources that are in our pockets. God, we just think about all that you've given to us. It's all from you. And one day it all goes back to you. May we manage it well for the time that we have it. Would you look at the way we manage your stuff and find us worthy, maybe even to manage more? But God, I want every single one of us to experience that kind of peace that only comes from knowing it's all yours. And we just get to be part of it. And we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. You guys have a great week. We'll see you next week.